really, I think, if we really want to put the synopsis on this trip, or what the whole foundation of why we're here, and why we're taking this trip, and the places that we're visiting, and the things that we're seeing, it's reduced down to three things: honor, respect, and remembering. And it's that simple. And so when you apply those things, not just to your head knowledge, but to your heart knowledge, then it starts to make sense to you as to what sacrifice is, what honor is, what's been paid for you and I to have the things that we've had. And I know it's difficult at 14 to think outside of who you are today, but as you continue to transition into young adults, this idea of who you are in this journey and the people that came before us, we're all connected. So when that makes sense to you, this battle for the soldiers on both sides of the fight will really start to make sense in your head a little bit, as complicated of a story that it is. So this is the 7th Michigan, and I'm not going to bore you with the entire history of the 7th Michigan. When the war broke out, though, everyone was clamoring to be part of the 1st Michigan Regiment. Everyone thought the war was going to be over in 60, 90 days, and these guys were bored at home. They wanted to do their patriotic duty, and they were going to put down this rebellion and come back home and get back into the rhythm of life. And like we said, the only thing predictable about war is? Unpredictability. So the war raged on for 4.5 years, over 600,000 KIAs, and times more wounded. And so the 7th Michigan does not make it into the 1st. The guys from the 7th don't make it to the 1st. Company B, originally you'd have 10 companies to a regiment. A regiment would start the war with 1,000 soldiers, and when these guys came, like our docent said today, our tour guide, an average regiment has 350 soldiers. You had people getting sick, you had people dying, you had people deserting, you had people going home because they just were tired for lots of reasons. On July 1, 2, and 3, the people here were believers. These guys were the truest of the true, and they were the bravest of the brave, and they were all in. So they knew exactly what stood before them, and the journey that they had taken to this point, they knew that this was serious business, very serious business. So the 7th Michigan Company B consisted of Mason guys, Dansville guys, Leslie guys, and Stockbridge guys. They were called the Coturnius Guard. A guy named by Frederick Coturnius came from Kalamazoo, trained up our boys in Mason in like 1857. That was kind of our militia. They didn't have state police, they didn't have any type of protection. And when the war broke out, the Coturnius Guard became Company B of the 7th. And so they went off to war. The captain of Company B was a guy named Philip McKernan. He was a lawyer in town. And they rotated their officers every year so that when the war broke out, this man was the captain. Well, before the 7th ever fired a shot, before the 7th ever saw combat, this man contracted typhoid fever, and we all know that more people died in the Civil War of disease than getting shot and killed. He dies. His best friend escorts his body back to Mason. He's buried at Maple Grove Cemetery. We're going to be planting flowers on his grave next week. And he rides the train back with him, and he has a military burial there at Maple Grove. He returns back to his unit, and Steele becomes the captain. And through the rank of the progression of advancement, he becomes a lieutenant colonel. His name's Amos Steele, and he went by his middle name because he is a junior. Okay, so he becomes the captain. Or actually, this particular badge is a lieutenant colonel. And so they know what they're up against. Well, he's shot and killed here. So Amos Steele is killed here, and this is where he dies. His body is brought back. There was a little bit of confusion whether he was buried in the battlefield or he wanted to be buried here, but he didn't get that wish. His dad had him brought back, and he was buried on July 29th on a Sunday morning with full Masonic rites. He was a Freemason. And so we have that all documented in newspapers, and so that's a fact. And so he's buried right here in Mason, or right there in Mason. Now, when the war was over, you had what we call these GAR posts, right? We talked about that in class, about having these GAR posts that were named after fallen heroes of their communities, and they were like the VFW, American Legion. They were war organizations, military organizations, veterans organizations. And these are the two ribbons that represent the two posts that were in Mason. And these are very rare, and I find these are really something that I feel very proud of bringing back to Mason. These will eventually be at the courthouse or City Hall or someplace like that, because they belong in our town, and that's where they're going to be for as long as I can keep them. Now, ironically, a year later, his brother, Henry Steele, who was part of the 26th Michigan, also part of the 2nd Corps, was shot and killed at North Anna River, part of the Wilderness Campaign. After the war was over, his dad had a party go down to the place where he was buried along the riverbank and brought his body back. They exhumed his body, his remains, and they are both buried together next to each other at Maple Grove Cemetery. So this family gave up 2 sons for the cause. Both were shot and killed in the head. Or, shot in the head and died. Complete sentence, shot and killed in the head. So we got that going on there. And then David was talking about, how these guys wanted to reconnect with their war buddies, and how these monuments kind of became, and how these parks started becoming reunion places. You'd have state encampments, you'd have national encampments, you'd have battlefield encampments, you would have regimental encampments. And what we have here is a really special photograph of the 7th Michigan standing right here in front of this monument in 1913, and they came here for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And you had all these old boys, and where was the tent city? Do we know where the tent city was for the? Right out here, right out here. And this is them standing in front of their monument. You can see there's vegetation and trees here. So this is 50 years later, so whether these trees were here or not during the battle, I don't know that. But this is all part of the 2nd Corps, and this was right in the thick of it right here. Yeah.
In that picture, I don't see the top where it says 7th Michigan.
It's there. It's kind of washed out. Trust it's there. So that's what this represents. Kind of a little side note here. This man here is Bodish. He's from Stockbridge. He had 3 brothers. One was killed. He lost an arm. He had one brother who deserted, went to California. Another brother who died 5 years after the war from wounds. So that family was certainly impacted by this war. He lost his arm. If you notice, there's a man right here in this picture, and he's got his sleeve buttoned to his coat, and this is him. What happened was he was pickpocketed. This article talks about him being pickpocketed. He didn't have enough money to take the train home, and the boys raised enough cash for him to make his trip back to Stockbridge. There's lots of conversations about what that story represents. So going back just to the 3 points that we want to kind of walk away from this whole entire weekend is, remembering, respecting, and honoring. And I've yet to be convinced by anyone to this point in this journey that that's not important. As a matter of fact, when we lose that, we're going to be in a really bad place. And so as you guys continue to kind of develop, you want to take that stuff into your consciousness and make that part of your personality. All right, one last thing. So, kind of an ironic story. Like next week, we're going to plant flowers down at Gettysburg. We're going to plant flowers down at the cemetery, right? About 7 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was a man in his 90s who wanted to know why there were flowers planted on his great-grandfather's grave. Well, the sexton, who was the person in charge of the cemetery, said, well, there's a history teacher that brings the students down and they plant flowers and so forth. So he wanted to meet me. So he came over to my house. I have a Civil War soldier carved out of a walnut tree by a carver that was hit by lightning, and it kind of turned into being Amos Steele. And I have Company B, and I have in the back of it, killed July 3rd, 1863. I know, it's a little over the top. That's
I like it.
Yeah,
that's cool.
It is. That's cool. I should have brought a picture of that. It's really kind of. So I got the little 2nd Corps thing on his. I really said, he did a nice job. And I look out in the drive, and there's this really elderly man out there, and he's kind of upset, and I go out and greet him, and introduces me to himself as William Steele. I've been looking for family members of these guys forever. I could never understand why two boys, two men from a family that was prominent as this family was, there wouldn't be an ancestor who was curious about their service and their sacrifice. Long story short, William and I become friends. He never knew a picture existed of his great-grandfather. I had these photographs. And I said, well, do you want to see a picture of your great-grandpa? And he almost starts crying. So we developed a great friendship. And he had this in his closet, and he goes, this belongs in Mason. And he said, I can't imagine this being any better suited than for what it's being used for and how I share it and so forth. So he presented me a sword that was Amos Steele's, and it was brought back to Michigan from the battlefield. And I show you this not to celebrate, now you know this anyway, but not to glamorize, romanticize, sensationalize war. War is insanity. But it speaks for itself. I have all this in terms of the provenance and documentation. It's legit. I did have a forensic scientist look at this, and she confirmed that absolutely that it's blood. But it could be a horse, it could be anyone's blood. There was a lot of blood around here. And why the family wouldn't have wiped it off, or maybe, you know, that era, they did some different kinds of things when they dealing with their dead and dealing with their loved ones. So maybe they wanted to keep the blood in the blade to remember his service and his sacrifice. But this is just a regular Civil War soldier. This is shark skin, and it's also a non-regulation sword. So it wasn't issued by the United States, which I think speaks to his humility. I'm injecting it, making it up basically. Just what I want to think he's like. But I think he was we'll stop right there. This is his sword, and it still has on the blade, bearing the blood up and down the blade on that. And so I had a forensic scientist say 100% that it's blood, whether it's his blood or not. I could still probably do a little DNA testing if I could give it someone. Like some hair or something like that. Send me his dentures. So, you know, it just speaks to the reality that a lot of people did some pretty heroic things for you and I, and we're here to remember that. So, guys, you want to add anything to that or anything?